Yo,
Hello, Will.
hey,
Right,
can you
so
hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly. I am just trying to get my makeshift phone holder ready. Fine. Ah, screw it. Let's just give it a go this way. Whereabouts are you at the moment?
I'm at home in Cornwall.
So I'm thinking just a rambling conversation and then see what happens.
Yeah, that's good.
So the Chris Opie intro. I first heard about Chris Opie when my brother started racing. I got immensely obsessed with racing pretty soon afterwards. At that point in the UK, you were the guy to beat. You were the best rider in the UK. You're arguably the best domestic pro that our country's had, or certainly up there. Had some phenomenal results at pro continental level. I always remember you from racing. Just obviously your sprint was incredible, but I think your ability to move around the bunch, your bravery when moving around the bunch, and just your ability to be in the right place at the right time. I think I'll never forget there was a tour series in Wembley where you and Steele started at the back. And I was on the front trembling with nerves. And you guys were like having a chat, like, should we just, just you and me, should we just have a competition to see who can get to the front first? And he literally just went back to front in one lap whilst everyone was being dropped. I think Steele actually ended up winning. I think that was the year where at Bike Channel where you guys had some tires which were questionable to say the least. So you probably ended up somewhere beyond the railings. Um, but that's massively underselling your achievements on the bike. But I think in terms of these conversations, you've had a million and one conversations about what you've achieved on the bike. I would be keen to go maybe a little bit deeper, a little bit more behind the scenes into kind of Chris Opie's life as a family man. Like what fueled your love for the bike, your relationship with the sport, and how you kind of interweave that into your busy life with a wife and two kids. Ever since I started racing, I think what was apparent about the UK scene is that it seemed like quite a closed shop. So the guys who were at a similar level to you, the guys winning all these races, generally felt quite unapproachable. But you were the only guy. Actually, I'd say you and Yanto, who were just, no matter your achievements, no matter what team you were racing for, you were always like the most friendly, approachable guys, even to someone who was coming in at the very bottom, like an absolute whopper causing carnage in races. You were always so yeah, just so nice and friendly. And by the way, I'm looking right because I'm checking my notes, and I'm sure there's a more professional way of doing this. Um, so I want to dive in with a question for you, Chris Opie. With the benefit of hindsight, looking back on your racing career specifically, what advice would you give a 15-year-old Chris Opie just starting out?
That's a good question. I was actually thinking about this in the last week because I lent some wheels to Nick, one of the junior riders down here. And I was thinking to myself, what would if I was speaking to someone who's 20 years older than me ish, what would I want to hear from them? And I think when I was 15, it would have been very difficult to get me to listen. So I actually think the best advice would have been to have told me you need to stop thinking you know it all. You need to listen to those that are more experienced than you, and you need to absorb that information and put it into practice. Because I think that was something I was bad at. I was good at using the information that I wanted to use. So you could have five different styles of training plan, and I would choose the one that looked the most appealing to me, which in my mind was always volume. I just loved riding my bike a lot. It's
Mm,
not really that good for your body. So I would always find a way of justifying doing more cycling, more training. So the one thing I would say would be you need to learn to listen and be analytical about what it is you're hearing and
mm,
listen to the correct advice and take it on board more
mm,
so than I did back then. Because back then I was like, no, this is the pathway I'm taking. I wasn't interested in riding on a track, and that was a big thing back in 2003 when I was 15, and I just wanted to go and race in Europe, in France, in the Netherlands, in
mm.
Belgium, and that was my pathway in my head because that's what had happened 15 or 20 years ago. But actually, if we look at the proven pathway that I could have taken, which many of the people that I grew up racing with, they're now still racing even, that would have been the better path. So to have listened to those advising me Don't go off on your own. Don't go and isolate yourself in France. Don't take yourself off into the Netherlands and just become this small. Should have just listened, gone and ridden on the track more, accepted that that would have been the right means to achieving the goals that I wanted to achieve.
Mm. Okay, so this is, I think what you're touching on is joining the British Cycling Academy program, Olympic program, whatever it might be.
Yes, essentially. I led the junior road series, so it wouldn't have been out of the question to have been at the level to join it.
Mm. Okay, so how, if you had taken that different decision, how do you see that kind of parallel life of Chris Opie playing out if you had taken on board this advice, which I'm not saying you regret not taking it on, but it sounds like there's questions in your mind whether you did the right thing in inverted commas.
So that's very double, because I never would have met my wife. I never would have had my children. I wouldn't have made the friends that I went on to make. You mentioned Janto before. I actually said to him in November last year, we went to Wales for a few days of riding. And I said to him, I think if my life and my career had panned out as I'd wanted it to, I wouldn't be the person I am. And actually, I'm quite happy with who I am. And I like the person I am on the whole. So I can't regret not making the decisions that I made along the way, because they've led to who I am today. If I'd made different decisions, I would have been much less likable.
Okay, that's interesting to know. And I think, going back to my earlier point, which I didn't make very well, it's great that you like yourself. And I think it's such a common thread of the narrative in the sport. Like, everyone likes you. You were such a likable guy in the sport, and that wasn't due to, in my opinion, I think that's your nature, that's your character. It's not necessarily the decisions you took in your life. So I would kind of push back on that and say, even if you did take that other road, I think you fundamentally would still be an incredibly caring, approachable person in my opinion. And I just wanted to go back to something you touched on, because I had a little later in my questions. I didn't want to kind of get too intense too soon. I wondered how much was loving riding your bike and how much was needing to ride your bike. How much was obsession, and I guess in some ways addiction, albeit a healthier addiction to, other things we could have been addicted to. I wonder how easy it was not to ride your bike.
So the only time that I didn't love it was in 2018, and
I remember it well.
I absolutely loved riding my bike, but I needed to ride it. As much as I loved it, I genuinely loved the feeling of two wheels. But I also need to do it for my own physical health, mental health, my identity. It's a large part of who I am. Weirdly, I was talking about school this morning with my wife, and I'm very lucky I can absorb information, but I never did any work at school. It wasn't for me. Actually, there was a story this morning. Our deputy head teacher took me to one side and he said, is it SATs when you're about 14 or 15 or something? He said, you're in the top 5% of this school, but yet you're not interested. I don't understand what's going on. I said, school's just not for me. There's nothing here that I want to do. I want to go off and ride my bike. That's all I was interested in, making a career out of riding a bike. And it was everything. If I could wake up every day and I was able to just ride, I had nothing else to do, I'd be happy just riding. I would never get bored of it. I can't ever imagine being bored of it. It fulfills me in every single way possible. And it's the only activity that comes close to doing that, really.
It's incredible to hear that after so many years as well. Yeah, you mentioned 2018, and I remember I was in Cornwall that year. I think we were riding together relatively frequently. And I think it's no secret that the team slightly fell apart. Your career was up in the air. And I remember you telling me you found it really difficult to ride your bike alone at those times. So I'm interested to hear, why at that time was cycling not a relief? Why was that not a way to escape the stresses of contract negotiations? What was different about your relationship with cycling at that point?
So I'd already raced at the highest level that I was ever going to race at. Whether or not I knew that at the time, I probably didn't know it at the time, because actually that winter we received an email on December the 18th, a week before Christmas, saying we either stop the team right now or you will take a 50% pay cut. And I was supporting my family, 2 children, Micah, house. pets, cars,
Mm.
the standard things that a family has. And that pay cut just meant that that was not going to be possible without incurring a huge amount of debt. And it felt like every pedal stroke, my life was just falling further and further out of control and falling to pieces with every single pedal stroke. And I remember we spent New Year in the Netherlands after that email arrived, and I'd just go out and just cry because I just knew that something which was meant to be providing for my family was now going to be taken from it. And to this day, I'm still paying back financial debt because of what happened back then. Because as soon as something else came along, I had to leave cycling, as in racing, for a job. It wasn't like I could just work loads of hours doing something else. It wasn't going to provide that 50% loss. That it just wasn't possible. So I took a different job. I stopped racing on May the 31st, 2018, and started a new job on June the 1st. I wasn't even able to afford any time doing separate, having a little bit of time off to process it all. So there was literally 12 hours from one career to the next. And it really
that was straight into GCN.
Straight into GCN, yeah. Every single pedal revolution on the way was difficult. In absolute honesty, it was the hardest thing ever. It's like, when you go out and you ride and you haven't eaten enough and you're about to blow. It was like that all the time. I had no energy. It just it sucked the absolute life out of me, and it was really difficult. I still enjoyed the feeling of riding a bike, but I had to ride it because I still had to do these races. And at that stage, it wasn't providing for my family. It wasn't providing for me because the fulfillment, part of the fulfillment wasn't provided for my family. The only bit that was nice was that I genuinely enjoy cornering, or I enjoy the physical feeling of training, but I had to really push hard to turn the pedals at all. That was dark.
Yeah. No, it was, I don't think I knew the full extent of it, but I could tell you were struggling. How did that impact things at home? How did that impact the energy you had for two young kids, the energy you had for your wife? How were things off the bike at that point?
It was I feel like I missed 4 years of my children growing up, from 2018 until about 2022, when things started to slowly flow again in the way that I'd always hoped. And I feel like they've gone from being 6 years old and 4 years old to all of a sudden they're small adults in a way. A 12-year-old boy that goes to secondary school feels very much like a small adult. He wants to have his independence and things. And I completely missed it because of the difficulties that I had. And it's a real shame. I feel like I missed a lot, and I find that very difficult. It's one of the hardest things to deal with. But also throughout that time, it's hard to have provided the life for them that I felt like we were going to provide for them. And that's upsetting. I can accept that I can't do anything about that. But it does change how you feel. My children, I feel like I had a nice youth, a nice childhood. I don't feel necessarily that my children will look back and say the same. And rightly so. They were in absolute turmoil and chaos surrounded by it.
So this is the turmoil and chaos you're describing. Is that you having to move around a lot, or is that more your mental state when you were just clinging onto, fighting as hard as you could to make it work as a bike rider, or was it a mixture of everything?
I think the first 6 months of 2018, nothing really changed for the children. I was probably a bit miserable. I probably was a bit less motivated to move, but they were so young then, when they were 6 and 4, they probably didn't notice it. But it was the period after starting at GCN, and then the first 18 months or so after I'd left, that was when I think they would have noticed the chaos and the difficulties, and it was absolute torture. I never wanted to stop racing, but it was the only way I could see, the only thing I could see that would resolve the situation we were in. It didn't work at all. It just made life worse. I'd hoped it would give me more time at home. It didn't give me more time at home. And it was things got worse. Yeah. For that first 2 years at GCN, it was terrible. For everyone involved, it's a miracle that we still have a marriage. I don't think Mike would remind me of that. Which is the right thing to still have. It's really fortunate. But then if you look into the divorce statistics of families after an athletic career of any kind. They're pretty high. It's scary.
Do you feel it was particularly the strains of GCM, which from what I've heard, it can be a pretty rigorous, demanding place to work? Or was it having to deal with life on life's terms when you didn't have, you'd done whatever it was, 20 years of a rigorous training program, always knowing what you were doing each day, every day to the minute, always had a target, always had something to focus on. Suddenly, bang, that's all gone. You're into a new world with GCN, and there's this massive void where cycling used to sit. Do you think it was just the strains of GCN, or do you think it was not having that obsession and massive love in your life of training and racing?
Yeah, 100% the latter. The workload was pretty minimal. You sat in an office most of the time twiddling your thumbs. Genuinely, there wasn't a lot to do. Every now and again there'd be a script, but you could blast through 1,500 words in half an hour if you need to. The knowledge is in there. You just have to put it on a piece of paper, so that's easy. It was more the lack of control. You talked about I'd spent my whole life essentially living as a self-employed person, dictating my day on my own terms. Yeah. It was the removal of that and the removal of any flexibility, any freedom, the time to see my family, which is something that I was going to stop racing for. And then the environment of, they just had a poor management structure at the time. I'm sure things are different now, but it was not the workload. The workload couldn't have been much easier. And I think maybe actually, if had it been a higher workload, you might have had a little bit less time to feel like you weren't being productive and achieving things.
Is it right to say that after GCN, you then decided to get back into racing with St. Piran? Obviously, COVID hit and it never quite materialized. But I'm interested to know what your thought process was when returning to the sport.
Yeah. So it was a 6-month notice period, which was quite challenging at the time. So I handed my notice in the October 2019, before the world had ever heard of COVID-19. And it meant that I wasn't going to be free until April. I did, fortunately, end up leaving a little bit earlier. I stood up. I was asked a question one day, and I just stood up. I genuinely floods of tears, walked out, and I've never been back since. Which was good. They allowed me to have that time off. My thought process of returning to racing was I'd had about 18 months where I'd managed to actually speak to individuals that had far more knowledge than some of the people that I'd spent the rest of my career working with, just because science was evolving at such a pace, actually, around training. So it's not that the people that I'd worked with previously didn't know the right amount. It's just that things moved at such a pace from around 2016, 17 onwards. I felt like I'd learned a lot. I'd learned a lot about myself. I'd had a period of physical rest, which is probably a good thing for the first time. I had once previously had a little bit of time off when I had glandular fever. But otherwise, since I was 10 years old, essentially all I'd done is ride a bike. And I really believed that I was going to be better than I'd ever been, because I physically was better than I'd ever been. I was the same weight, but I was aerobically more capable. And I was just as strong anaerobically and neuromuscularly. I could still do the same sprint numbers. And I had this newfound motivation to get my happiness back and my life back. So I started training in the November, December, and by the February, I really felt very, very good on a bicycle again. It was a really amazing feeling. Obviously, it didn't last long because we had COVID, but in a way, that was probably the best thing that could have ever happened. It allowed myself to have that period of time believing I was going to return to doing something that made me happy. I was going to work alongside it, just in terms of racing. The racing was for the happiness and to get away from what I was doing, and I was going to work alongside it. Both of those things really excited me. It gave me a chance to continue developing a career away from cycling, but it also gave me a chance to revisit the identity that I'd always held for myself. I continued to stay fit throughout 2020. Then into 2021, when COVID was easing, we did a training camp in Cornwall with the team that I was racing for. And I, at that point, had already started the job that I currently do now for Le Col, the clothing company, the cycle clothing company. Yeah. So I wasn't taking racing and training as seriously. We did the training camp, and I felt like by far and away the strongest rider, which is not to discredit the other riders I was with. It was, I was physically very good, but it didn't seem right to me that me half-heartedly riding my bike meant that I was the strongest rider on that team. And that kind of took away, I wanted to be challenged. In the past, I'd always been really pushed and challenged by teammates. And again, it's not to detract from their abilities, it's just to highlight my mindset. I was normally never the strongest in a team, especially when it came to aerobic efforts and riding for sustained periods of time, I was normally, mid group or slightly worse.
The town sign though, always first past the town sign.
Exactly. Keep on and then pop past. And that kind of made me think, well, if I'm not being pushed and challenged, what is it providing me with? Do I still need to do this? And I decided, the whole idea was to train for the Tour of Britain, which was visiting Cornwall.
Mm-hmm.
To train and do that, just as a singular event, it's quite brutal, the Tour of Britain. And I also knew that my level really wasn't high enough to compete to the level that I wanted to represent myself at in the Tour of Britain. And I decided halfway through the year, it just wasn't going to happen. I was enjoying my job, still enjoying my job now. And to spend all of that time away from my family just to fulfill a goal that I'd set 2 years previously, I was no longer the same person in 2021 to what I was in 2019. So I decided that whilst it was nice to have had that period of time to train and to get fit and to experience all sorts of different things within cycling, I wasn't going to make a return to competition in that way.
And at the end there, you highlighted something which was on my mind a lot when I transitioned away from racing and did a gravel campaign of sorts. And it's weighing up. So, I wasn't being paid to ride my bike. And, I think you were in a similar situation where you were having to work alongside. So it was difficult to justify not only the hours away from my son, from Atlas, and helping out with Abby, but it was also difficult to justify getting back from a 6, 7, 8, at the time I was looking at doing Garmin Unbound, 8, 9 hour ride on the weekend and just being absolutely cooked, like doing my fatherly duties, but being present, but only physically. My mind was somewhere else. I was finding everything overwhelming. I'd get back from these long rides and then be bobbing a 9-month-old baby. And when I look back on it, I can tell for me it was obsession. It was an addiction to the feeling that cycling gave me, having something to focus on target wise, probably an obsession with burning calories and a fear of putting on weight. So I'm interested to know how, with the family dynamic, how did that all sit at the time where you were training for St. Pierre and you had these big goals, but doing 20 hours on the road a week was something you weren't actually being paid for? Presumably you'd get home and the kids would want to go and do things. And, from everything I've seen, I know you're an amazing dad, but after 20 hours on the road, it can be hard to fully absorb yourself in what Boas wants to do and really enjoy it when you're exhausted. So how did the family dynamic play out at that kind of strange time in your cycling career?
Yeah, so I think the fact that we were at least all together, which is something that we haven't been for 2 years, throughout 18 and 19, it made it easier to manage. But yeah, like the quickest and easiest way to remove any element of patience is just to go training, isn't it? And fatigue yourself massively.
This is so true.
When you come home,
and you go
and
to
you're
the park afterwards. Oh, that first 30 minutes when you walk in the door, even those first few minutes when you walk in the door, it's for me, it's like, okay, I need to separate myself. I need to get some food, even if it's just like quick recovery shake and some carbs. And then I'll go into the room and start dealing with life. Otherwise, I can be horribly short-tempered. But I interrupted you. Sorry.
Yeah, no, well, that's how it is, isn't it? When you come home and you're tired and hungry. I'm normally pretty good at making sure I have enough food on board so that I don't get home too hungry. Because I learned that quite quickly when Boas was younger. If I came home hungry, there was a good chance that I'd quickly get poorly if he had something from preschool, nursery, whatever he was going to. So actually making sure I never got to the point that I was super hungry has always been a good practice. But yeah, it is hard. I was fitting my training in and around work. So I'd go training before work at the time or at lunchtime. So it didn't impact the children too much, but it did also mean that my training hours were reduced. It was just a question of I would wake up early, go out at 5 o'clock in the morning. That's my favorite time of day within reason. If you're motivated and you want to do it, I wouldn't do it willingly every single day, but if there's a reason to do it, then it makes sense to me. But I definitely noticed that I'm calmer. So the best way of comparing it, or to understand how it was I'm definitely calmer now when I do 3 different types of exercise. So I do some strength training, some cycling, and tiny bit of walking or running. And the best way of managing it is to do it when they're not around. So I'm not coming back to them tired. I do it for short periods, so it's not long and draining like it was with the endurance training when you're trying to do road races. And I can manage that. It's easy. If I do an hour super intense exercise, it doesn't fatigue you in the same way that a long endurance ride does. You know, you're tired and sore, and you're exerted, but you're not mentally drained as well. And I think that's the biggest difference. Is I don't now do enough to fatigue myself mentally from training in the same way that I did previously, and that allows that extra capacity. Whereas back then, it definitely all would have been a bit of a strain, and it's like, oh, what do I have to do with now? The only flip side to it is a 12-year-old boy in secondary school has slightly more complex issues that he might like to discuss with you to a 9-year-old boy that was at primary school. So there is an element of knowing that you are going to have to deal with some more grown-up situations that will need a lot more mental time dedicated to it, to discuss through it with him, and so that he understands it and that you understand what he's experiencing as well. So that changes, and that also means then that, well, maybe I'm a little bit more aware now that if I compete for myself for no reason. So it really has taken a back seat in that regard. It's no longer the most important thing, whereas 3 years ago probably was still the most important thing, that first and foremost my training is going to happen no matter what, whereas now it fits in and around things. So that's the biggest way to understand what it was like back then. It had to come first. I had to prioritize it. Everything else was slightly secondary to it, whether that's just, you know, ever so slightly behind, or if it's a long way behind. It depends on the day as well, doesn't it? Depending on how much you're doing and what you're trying to aim towards. But yeah, whereas now it's leaving a little bit of capacity available for other things that will crop up.
Did you feel your training strategy had to change at all with a newborn, or was there a very clear understanding that this was your job? So much like, you know, your dad might have some paternity leave from the office, and then he can't suddenly start, you know, taking half days from his job in the city or whatever it is just because he's got a newborn. Or was there an understanding that actually you had to make some concessions now? You had to do shorter rides, you had to rest less, eat more, whatever it might be.
Yeah, as to the best of my knowledge, nothing changed. I still trained and lived as if that was the most important thing. I was a full-time athlete bike rider at the time, so it was relatively easy to do. Fortunately, he slept well, so that we didn't lose too much sleep. And if we did lose any sleep, it wasn't me that lost sleep, it was my wife, Micah. And that helped as well. There's just understanding from everyone. The only problems that ever arose were in 2014 when he kept on bringing bugs back from when he started nursery. And then I was poorly for about 3 months. It ruined the season, really. That was the only time that things changed. The rest of the time, to the best of my knowledge, it was always just, this is your job. You have to do this first and foremost. And then everything else around it will find its place. And I liked that. There was nothing more motivating than knowing that you were having a child on the way. So you really put everything into, you know, weighing your food, going to bed on time, stretching, training, making sure everything's organised. It was nice. It was a good period. I used to have this recurring dream of being able to jump, but I couldn't fly, but I could land wherever I wanted to land. It was nice. It was really good.
Nice. You mentioned that a little bit later in your career, you quickly worked out that if you kept yourself well fueled, you got home and found yourself with more patience because you weren't coming through the door with that kind of hanger or that depleted feeling where you feel a bit irritable, a bit on edge. Were there any other little strategies or tips and tricks that you started implementing to make sure that you could still do your training that you were paid to do, but you could also be the best father that you could be considering your strenuous job?
Yeah, the power nap. Absolutely the best thing. It's like, you know, when you turn your computer off and back on, it shuts down all the programs. It's like that. If I sleep for between 5 and 7 minutes, genuinely that's enough. It was definitely more when I was racing. It would have been more like 20 to 30 minutes. But it's like I wake up as a different person. And I do it even now, almost daily. And I have no problems admitting that. 5 to 7 minutes. Just close everything off, fall asleep. I normally fall asleep listening to a really... The more interesting the documentary is that I'm listening to, the faster I fall asleep, because the more I shut off. And And that's it. Just wake up 5 to 7 minutes later, and I feel like a new me, and I'm ready to deal with anything. I really am a morning person, so I might wake up between 5 and 6 most mornings. If I wake up later than that, I feel a bit groggy. And then at 12, 1, 2 o'clock, a real quick power nap, and then I feel rejuvenated and ready for whatever's next.
Nice. That's insane that 5 minutes and you're a changed man. I got to try that.
I think it's just me personally. I don't know if anyone else does it. So it's just a thing. I'm just like
a 5 minute OP reboot. I'm going to give it a go. So I'm interested to know if at this point in your life, someone said to you, right, you can't ride the bike for 2 months. You also can't go and obsess about anything else, running, climbing, strength work. You're basically going to do 2 months of inactivity physically. Of course, you can walk to the shops. You could do the things which most people do who don't necessarily enjoy sport. How do you think you'd deal with that?
Not very well at all. No. That would be like torture. So I had a vasectomy in April this year, and I had to have time off, and it was just awful. The first week was sort of like, okay, well, I know I've got to take a bit of time off, but I was really strict. Now I barely moved, like literally less than 1,000 steps a day, just to make sure that I gave myself the best chance of healing as fast as possible. But then after a week, when I was thinking in my head I was going to exceed all these medical expectations, and I'd be back doing what I love doing, which is moving, training, and that didn't happen. And then a second week passed, and I still wasn't ready to get back to training in the way that I wanted to. It was 2.5 weeks of complete rest before I was like, okay now. And if I'm really honest, even that was probably a little bit too soon. Like, the doctors tell you you'll know, but I think you only know when you've done something that you shouldn't have done.
Yeah, exactly. And I think your drive the drive you need to be a professional athlete is going to tell you a little bit sooner than most normal people that you're ready to go. You are professionally good at dealing with pain. But I'm interested, just to go back to that point, 2 weeks was almost torture. A month or 2 months would sound almost unmanageable. But what are the feelings?
So I lose patience, absolutely all patience. I become very irritable. I like things to happen instantly, like quickly, like, come on, like, why is everything happening so slowly? Come on, speed up. Like, whether that's getting your shoes on to go to school, kids, or whether that's, okay, right, let's get the ingredients out of the fridge to make dinner. Doesn't matter what it is. Just if it's not happening instantly, I'm already bored and frustrated. And then when it comes to a lack of training, I feel like my heart is going to jump out of my chest. It's just like there's this feeling in me that needs to be exerted. It's like, I suppose in a way, when you go to the zoo and you see a lion pacing up and down by the cage, I feel like that. I just feel like I'm trapped, and I need to escape whatever this feeling is that's inside of me. I need to get rid of it. And I first noticed this in 2018, about 6 weeks after I stopped racing. I was still riding my bike, not a huge amount, but either like an hour of an evening or lunchtime, morning, whatever it was, maybe 6 hours a week. But that wasn't quite enough. I reckon I need to do 8 to 12 hours a week, depending on time of year and how fit I am. I need to do around 8 to 12 hours of exercise every week in order to keep this feeling at bay. And back then I discovered that there was something else that would keep that feeling away, and that was alcohol. And obviously that's very bad, but I became very addicted to the feeling of getting rid of this caged, this need for exertion is really what it is. I don't know how else to describe it. And that creeps in quite quickly. Within 2 weeks, it's already there.
That sounds like fear to me.
No, I wouldn't describe it as that, because I've had counselling now for 4 years regularly. To start with once a week, and then once a month, and then once every other month, which is what I do now. And it's not bad. It's a really physical feeling, because there's no emotion attached to it. There's no thought attached to it. It's just a feeling of this energy is inside of me, and I need to do something with this energy. It's not it doesn't show itself as anything. No, everyone feels anxious at some point, don't they? Or they have a fear. Or there's something else you said as well, but it doesn't come across in that way. It's just this, and sometimes I'm not even aware that it's starting to happen. Like, it's quite mentally aware of myself. And it really is a physical feeling. It's like my heart needs to do something and my lungs need to be stretched. And it really is my chest cavity, which is I sort of like it in a way because it compels me to go and do the exercise. Because there is a part of me that thinks I could go without exercising sometimes. But the reality is that I can't. It's just something my body craves. And I've done it since I was 9 years old, very, very consistently and regularly. I think it is just a part of who I am.
For sure. For sure. And I think, in my opinion, it's relatively interesting that we started or somewhere early in this discussion, we were talking about whether the bike was an addiction or whether it was just solely love, or only a thing that just absolutely gave you this immense feeling of freedom and total passion. Yet we've circled round to when you couldn't ride your bike, the thing which allowed you to deal with life, deal with your own feelings, emotions, whatever we want to call them, was alcohol for a while. And it's interesting that that's what you swap the bike for. So do you think that there might be an element of the sport that is slightly more obsession based as opposed to purely love based?
Yeah, I'm sure there is. I'm sure there is. Whether it's from nature or whether I've nurtured it along the way, there is definitely something there that calls for me to do it, even if I'm not mentally wanting to do it 100%. But
Yeah.
what that is, or I don't know. I suppose it's, I don't know. Along the way, I've definitely, the habit of doing it, that formed habit of almost every day wanting to ride a bike or telling myself I'm going to ride a bike. It's definitely it's something that exists. I have to say, I had to stop drinking alcohol, and I've not had alcohol since December the 31st, 2021, because
Good for you.
I had an incredibly unhealthy relationship with it.
Is that something you got help with, or did you just deal with it on your own?
Through the regular counselling, I had help with it.
Mm.
I did a trial period of 3 months, expecting that to reset my relationship with it, and that didn't work at all. Just very quickly slipped back into the way it was. So I will never ever drink alcohol again, and that's the only way that I'll be able to manage that. And I'm quite happy with that. It's not a problem at all. I don't miss it now. There were definitely times in the first 2 years where I probably did, and it was just a way of numbing the emotions that I'd had following 2018.
Absolutely, and I think that's what all these obsessions and addictions do. They numb feelings that you aren't able to deal with. I do wonder whether our exercise obsession is in some ways unhealthy, because if we didn't have it and then we didn't also turn to drugs or alcohol, we would be forced to confront these things, which we find really difficult to deal with, and we'd be forced to work through them, as opposed to running away from them or cycling away from them. I wonder, when we're not able to run or cycle and we don't want to drink alcohol or do drugs, is life going to be very, very difficult? Are we escaping the inevitable, or escaping these really difficult things which we need to front up to and work through them and hopefully make ourselves better people by doing so? It's not really a question, but it's just something which crosses my mind a lot. Like you said, that drive, that feeling in you to telling you, willing you, pulling you, that almost magnetizing to get on the bike, get pedaling, burn some energy, get rid of this feeling. I think you said it drives you to ride even when your body is, or your mind perhaps is telling you not to. So when you are exhausted and you don't want to ride, there's something pulling you onto that bike. And I'm wondering how that's impacted you over the years when you're exhausted basically and you should be resting, but that feeling isn't allowing you to rest.
Yeah, definitely. When I first moved to France, again, going back to listening to the wrong advice and then taking it to the extreme, I was told that I should lose weight. I went there weighing 69 kilos, and by May, I weighed 63.5 kilos. I weigh 82 now, and I feel like I look okay. So even as someone that wanted to race at my best, I was 75-ish kilos. I never should have weighed as little as that. The year after, I suffered with glandular fever. I don't believe they are unrelated incidents. So yeah, that wanting to push and to continue, when I should have just allowed myself to recover, probably caused me to contract glandular fever, and that wrote off 2006, 7, 8 almost of my early career. If that hadn't happened, things could have been different. Again, I think you can always learn something from any of these experiences, but only if you know what you're looking for. So I don't, yeah, the obsession with exercise, I think it's a funny one because without it, I don't know what to fill my time doing. As in, I have a little bit of spare time, and I like, if I can, to ride my bike or do some sort of exercise. It's a really good social outlet as well, and I think we all need to socialize. Cycling is not always that social. It's actually sometimes quite hard to find the time to ride with someone else, isn't it? Or you need to find the time to ride with someone that wants to ride at the pace that you want to ride at, or do the sort of ride that you want to do. But I think if I didn't have it as an obsession, I would feel quite, something would be missing. I'm sure in the future, I'm old and I'm not physically capable of doing what I'm quite aware that I won't be able to do it to this level for the rest of my life. And I'm prepared to find something else, not gardening or painting, but something which is, I can imagine that walking could be nice one day in the future, or whatever. I think it's okay to have something which is like a satellite you're the satellite moving around it almost. Like it's there, it's consistent, it has to happen, and you just orbit around it, and every now and again, it's time again to do some.
And I totally agree with that. I think what I'm finding difficult being a parent is if I make plans, if I decide to eat a certain amount of food in order to go out on a ride of X amount of hours or go on this hard run, and kind of last minute plans change because Atlas is ill or Abby's got to go off and do something. It's that internal struggle between wanting to help Abby and go and take Atlas to the park and then go and take him to the zoo. That should be the most important thing for me in my life. And then I've got that obsessive part of me, which is like, but you ate that much yesterday. And no, you plan to go and do this right. You put it in Training Peaks. It's this kind of internal conflict. And then it's this self-condemnation, feeling like I'm a terrible father because I'm even questioning which is more important to me, to go out and burn these calories and do this ride or help out with Atlas. And I know which one is absolutely the most important thing theoretically, but there's definitely some demons inside me which tell me that I should go and do the run or ride, and I won't be able to function like a normal human being if I don't. And those are the difficult, there's some quite difficult things I find with sport and managing it around a family life. And I'm wondering if you kind of have any of those same feelings, if your plans get upended the last minute because the kids are ill or they've decided they want to go to the water park or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, absolutely, those things happen. There's a window, isn't there, like of time, and once that window closes, it's you have to accept. That's not happening in the way that I'd hoped. I can make up for it in the future, perhaps. Maybe a bigger window opens. Maybe I just need to make the most of a similar sized window that's coming. But last week I had some mechanical issues with the bike. Again, I was doing something for work, so I had to ride within work hours, partly because of the school hours then. And the mechanical issues ruined it. 2 days in a row, actually. Chain and derailleur one day, partly my own fault, and then a seat post clamp the next day. Seat post clamp, not my fault, but it meant that's 2 days then of eating. Like you say, you eat to fuel something, don't you? So if you think you're going to do something big, you'll eat something pretty calorific, and that's what I did. And a large part of my training is to balance. I have a healthy appetite, and it does drop if I train less, but I quite like having an appetite. And if training offsets that a little bit, I know you can't out-train a bad diet, but it feels like it's fair and justifiable. And last Wednesday and Thursday, exactly what you've just described happened. My window of opportunity closed pretty abruptly just before 3 o'clock, which meant that one day I only rode for an hour, and the next day I couldn't even ride at all. And it eats away at you. But the further I distance myself time-wise from my cycling career, the easier those things become to accept and to manage and to move on. Like if that was when I was racing, that would have been catastrophic, devastating, and this is the worst thing that could possibly happen right now. I'm not going to hit the targets for what I needed to do in training this week, and I've been told that I needed to do them because my coach has said this, meaning that this was clearly the right preparation. Well, actually, you don't get fit from doing one bike ride. It's all connected. So actually, to have missed 1 or 2 days training once a year isn't going to kill anything. but it would have been upsetting. And then each year, maybe a few percent of that feeling wears away. And then you get to a stage now where it's like, okay, I'm old enough, I'm wise enough now. I know that it upsets me. It's really going to upset me because I really care about it. I want to be the best possible version of myself physically and mentally. And part of being good mentally for me is being good physically. I really believe that physical fitness is important for your mental health. And that comes with a quota of training or, striving for a physique or power numbers, whatever it is. For everyone, it will be something different. And when those training sessions then don't work out, it is upsetting, but it's not, I realize now it's not going to change anything. My attitude towards my children will change something, but the training that I've done won't actually change my attitude. It will change how I feel about my day. And then I have a choice then. Do I address them as if I've had a bad day, or do I brush it off and be like, you know what, there's always next week or the week after or a week in August. It doesn't matter. I'll catch up. I'll make it good with myself. But they rely on me now to be the father they need, not the father that maybe wants to be, that as in, they rely on me to put my race face on, or my parenting face, put it that way. You can spend a little bit of time then, okay, well, the 90 minutes that I had where I could have been training and dealing with what I need to do, I can now spend preparing myself for when they come back from school and readying myself for that first interaction. And I think that's something that I've learned, especially over the last 2 or 3 years. I'm really lucky in my job, actually. There are several dads, including Ganto, my manager Rob, colleague Max, and it's nice to hear different aspects of fathering and parenting, and you pick up little bits that you like along the way, don't you? And you think, oh, I can use that. Like, we all have, I know your dad, we all have perhaps an impression of how our fathers were, but there's nothing stopping you employing your own little tactics and your own processes along the way either, and picking them up from other people. And I think that's something that's really beneficial to try and adopt.
Absolutely. And I think it, like you say, the further you get away from your cycling career, it sounds like you are growing significantly wiser in that regard with managing parenting and the bike. And it sounds like that, understandably, that priority is starting to shift whilst you love and need the bike to keep you level-headed, patient, optimistic. It's amazing that you now kind of reinterpret these mechanicals as, oh, look, this is an opportunity for me to spend 90 minutes preparing myself for when the kids get home, or 90 minutes resting so that when they get home, I can be even more energetic than I was before. And I think that's one of many things from this conversation that I'm going to take and really try and employ in my fathering for sure. And I'm conscious I've taken up loads of your time, but I'm just interested to know, in terms of using the sport, the cycling, as a barometer for your fatigue levels in life. Like, how do you know when you've done too much on the bike? How is Chris Opie at home with the kids in the evening if you're in a phase and you're starting to borderline that burnout, that overtraining, that non-functional overreaching? How are you as a person with your kids?
Irritable, lack of patience. So it goes back to actually being exactly the same as if I didn't do any exercise. It's like I'm sure there's a name for the type of graph where, as you go up on this side, you get to the sweet spot in the middle, and it goes back down over the other side. So no exercise, perfect amount of exercise, and then it drops off when you start to do too much. That's it, really. The sore legs. Oh, you're like, oh, don't touch my legs. Don't really have. Yeah, I quite like muscle pain, to be really honest, because then I know that I've done something. And genuinely, if I don't have something that hurts, I feel like there's something wrong. So I like to make sure there's always some sort of level of muscle pain somewhere in my body.
I think that's a conversation for another day. I think we could delve into that, and I think any psychologist would go to absolute town on that one. I don't feel particularly qualified, but but I understand what you mean. I've had similar thoughts. Sorry, you were saying, so there's the sort of bell curve, and you basically end up in the same place with the kids, with your patients, as if you hadn't done anything.
Yeah, and it's normally endurance rides that will tip me over the edge. Anything over 3 hours, that starts to, whether it's just the way it's suited to my body or whether it's the mental fatigue, I don't know what it is exactly, but yeah, after I get to around a 3-hour ride, and I could probably do 3 hours nearly, or I could probably do 2.5 to 3 hours nearly every day and be fine. But it's on the days where you just tip it that little bit too far over the edge, and there must be something happening in my body, and it's just asked that little bit too much from me, demanded that little bit too much. Then I start to struggle, and then with the irritability and the lack of patience and just the fatigue and that instant, like, this has to happen now, that all starts to creep back in. Whereas there's this sweet spot in the middle where I feel just a little bit more mellow and a bit like, yeah, that was good. I've done the right amount of exercise there, as a feeling, not as a thought, but as a feeling in my body. I've just done enough sprints, or I still like to do similar intervals to what I did when I was racing. So I make them a little bit more sporadic to match the terrain, or a Strava segment. So yeah, there's this happy middle place where you do just enough to feel it. Like, I've taken the edge off the sensations. I'm not going to be irritable because I'm too fresh. But equally, you don't want to add so much fatigue that you're going to become irritable because you're just too tired, and you get that heavy head then as well, don't you? That comes with the fatigue, and it's just keeping it in the middle. And it's always a balancing act. And yeah, it's easy to get it wrong. It's easy to go out and spend a little bit too long riding. Wake up a little bit too early, push that a little bit too hard, and dig yourself a hole that's just a little bit too big to recover from. But every time you make a mistake, you can learn, can't you? And that's it. It's just
And do you think, once you find yourself, let's say you got a race coming up and it's in 3 weeks, and you've programmed a really succinct, structured build into it, but you notice that you are short with Boas when he gets back from school, and you're thinking, well, I've stuck to the plan, but it feels like I've perhaps gone too far over the other side for whatever reason. Perhaps stress is off the biker a little bit more than you factored in. Are you now willing to change your plan, or are you just going to crack on and do what's on Training Peaks?
So I'm going through that exactly right now, and I'm willing to actually not ride my bike. So I'm having a complete day off any exercise today. I can't remember the last time I did that exactly. No, I try to record something almost every day, which is not including a walk. I've started recording walks because it's just to me, it's also partly time outside away from my desk. And if I can, even if it means recording a walk, which I don't really class as exercise in the way that I want it to be, but it does help me understand, okay, I've made an effort every single day for the last however long to go out and do that sort of thing. So yeah, last week I had hoped to do 4 big days in a row. It didn't happen because of the mechanical issues. I then tried to make up for it at the weekend by doing a little bit more. And yeah, I'm in a place of tiredness and fatigue, but I'm quite happy. So I've decided, all right, well, that was a good amount. It's all based around I may or may not be able to do a race this coming weekend. I suspect it won't happen. I just don't feel. But if I'm going to race, I want to feel good. That's a large part of why I exercise. I want to feel good. And I don't feel like I'm performing that well, so that I might not do it. But at least I've given myself the opportunity to do it by resting on time, not overdoing it, but also that makes it more enjoyable to deal with the other things in life. Our car broke down at the weekend, for example. Got to deal with that. So dealing with that when you're tired doesn't happen. But hopefully with a little bit of rest, it will.
It sounds like you're being a lot kinder to yourself, and you have a much more kind of forgiving and understanding balance of family life. And yeah, it really surprised me actually when you said that there were a few tough years where you felt distance from the kids, because I've always looked at you and seen you as this amazingly active, present, committed father. Sounds like you didn't judge yourself as one, for a few years, but that's where you are now, and it's made me very happy to hear that.
I think you will. It's I would say the biggest thing over the last 6 years is talking to people. For the first 18 months to 2 years, I didn't think I could talk to anyone. I didn't want to stop racing. I didn't want to start the career I started. And the biggest thing is realizing that actually people are open to being spoken to on the whole, especially the people that I seem to have surrounded myself with. They are very willing to listen. That's the most important thing, because you can lock yourself up with your own thoughts and you can maybe think about them and analyze them, but it's highly unlikely you'll actually come up with a cure for those issues.
No,
and things will get worse.
Absolutely. I think that's amazing advice. And there's some sort of expression about not being able to fix something with a broken tool. But when your thoughts aren't in a good place, when you're generally feeling overwhelmed, anxious, depressed, I don't think you're ever going to think yourself out of that situation. So yeah, I think that's important and very actionable advice for anyone who cares to listen to this, and probably quite a good place to wrap up, because yeah, I'm very conscious you've given us over an hour, and just massively, massively grateful for your time.
Thank you for having me, Will.